People will die because of the BBC decision. Let me be clear about that.
I'm in the middle of us doing quite a lot of study on common law at the moment, as opposed to civil law, which is the established law that's come over and trumped common law.
From this small artery, the ulnar artery, on the wrist where there was a cut on Dr. Kelly, did not cause bleeding so rapid or so voluminous that he would have died. Is that as doctors we do not accept, without a great deal of reluctance, that he took his own life. And we live in what purports to be a country of laws, and the laws in this case, the law in this case has been subverted, undermined, and we won't have it.
Common law being the more ancient, fair, everybody is equal law, money and privilege and position don't come into it as they do with the civil law with which we employ currently.
And I will marshal all the media forces of darkness to hound you to an assisted suicide.
And so, breaking off a minute and looking at the BBC have broken their pledge to the public on many occasions, particularly in this clip, as you see, concerning 9/11 and the strong evidence that the BBC is willfully misleading the public.
Acknowledging that many examples can be cited to affirm the injurious role of the BBC and UK government, the false WMD threat sold to the public so as to justify the invasion and occupation of Iraq is just one example.
You can add into that the whole Jimmy Savile stabling, hiding, while it was clearly known what an atrocious criminal he was. For all those years he was working at the BBC, the sexed up document that took us into Iraq.
Because of the way the BBC have behaved and the propaganda by omission over the events of 9/11, I was genuinely concerned that they were complicit in the cover-up.
The BBC, since September 11th, has descended into just sheer and utter extremist propaganda. They're in utter denial about these 9/11 and the whole war on terrorism issue. They actually reported that Building 7 came down on September 11th, 20 minutes before it came down. Somebody fed them the script, but it got there too early.
BBC have been part of the construct that supports that narrative, and to my mind that makes them fully complicit in it. This isn't a case of keeping quiet. This is proactively going out of their way to perpetuate the monstrous lie and the tyrannical cover of horrendous acts of terrorism against our own citizens.
And so what we're looking at then is a criminal organisation, the BBC, and how they can get away with it for so long. And it's very much tied into the lack of legal investigation, whether that's law enforcement agencies or media investigative journalism or a legal system that can do that. And the purpose is very much propaganda. The purpose is very much to deflect the public. There's this huge weight of millions and millions of people who depend upon the BBC for their truths. They believe in the BBC. They've grown up to it. It's a sort of an identity aspect to their characters. And the BBC is trusted across the world. And this shouldn't be the case on account of the complicit criminality with which this programme will prove.
The BBC have withheld a huge amount of extremely powerful evidence which basically proves that the official story of 9/11 is not only false, it's completely impossible. So the BBC have certainly been in gross breach of their requirements through the Royal Charter and editorial guidelines on the issue of 9/11.
And then of course the report eventually comes out in 2008 that the building fell down due to fire. Well, I don't believe it. I simply don't believe it, and neither do 2,000 architects and engineers around the world, and millions of others for that matter. You don't have to be a scientist to see that the building was demolished.
We can say that the official theory about the towers is disproved as thoroughly as any such theory could possibly be. These facts taken together render the likelihood of the official theory essentially zero. The official theory is therefore an outrageous theory, whereas the alternative theory is, from a scientific point of view, the only possible theory.
And then you've got to look at the cognitive dissonance aspect. Cognitive dissonance being the inability to accept truths that are very much in conflict with the already established truths of an individual.
Well, cognitive dissonance is people's inability to see that which is right before their eyes because of the effect it will have on their reality.
So if someone comes along and says, hey, look, the BBC, your politicians, your leaders, your nation in general is not wholesome and true and good and honest as you have believed for all of your life, it's in fact quite the opposite, then cognitive dissonance often aggressively pushes that aside. Shoot the messenger, machine gun the messenger, because it's upsetting to the established worldview. You don't like uncomfortable truths if you're suffering from cognitive dissonance.
Basically, you're looking at information which is causing you to completely rethink your entire belief system, what your life has been about up to this point, and this is hugely confrontational to people, and they just don't want to go there. I've had people tell me that even if the official story is true, I don't want to know because I'm safe here, it works for me when I'm in this little bubble, I don't want to know about what's going on outside.
But as this program will show, just a little scratching of the surface shows something as the 9/11 cover-up to be a complete fabrication of the truth, and the Wizard of Oz drawing back the curtain and saying, hey everybody, that powerful leader that you've been worshipping with a cult of personality is in fact a fraud and a fake.
And the implications of what things like 9/11 mean, the implications of the government actually doing that themselves and then going and murdering millions of people around the planet as a response is just far too much for people to bear, and so they just go into complete denial.
And here's how it's done. Here are the control levers. And the media, whether it's newspapers, radio, TV, even entertainment, movies, Hollywood, etc., it's all very choreographed and very sophisticated to establish this whole worldview that the West has a moral high ground, that there's an ethical and wholesome policing, that we can hand over our autonomy to these trusting and caring authorities. And it's a fabrication.
There are many deeply disturbing truths that humanity must recognize if we're to be serious about addressing the grave dangers we face. Primary among them is the fact that our governments and the mainstream media are not here to serve the interests of the people. To the contrary, they're here to serve the interests of a tiny minority who lust for power and profit from war.
The BBC is a government department and a department of the intelligence network of Britain.
The two component parts of the security services and some of the high levels of the BBC are almost inseparable.
All sane people will agree that withholding information from the public that protects terrorists is not in the public interest, but more on that later.
The only time that the BBC has covered anything to do with the conspiratorial view of 9/11 was to set up and ridicule anyone that was saying actually the official story is not true.
Brought into a common law system whereby these organizations and the individuals upholding these organizations are looked at objectively and brought into justice, so that the financial clout and the positions can't influence justice, true justice.
So far from just even ignoring another view of what happened on 9/11, which they have largely done, when they have addressed it, it's been to ridicule those that were questioning it. That's not only not fair and not balanced, it's fundamentally biased in the way that they're dealing with this.
It is propaganda by omission. That's how they do it, and they're guilty of sin. And I'm on record as saying they're guilty of sin, and I stand by it absolutely. It's very, very easily provable.
I think the BBC has been rather like the health service. Far too many highly paid executives at the top compared to the number of people at the coalface. And the name of the game becomes protecting backside.
The BBC's executive are towing the line completely and won't allow any threatening criticism of our government agenda. When it comes to having high salaries, they're not prepared to speak up. and be counted. Because what it needs is moral courage. To stand up and say, I am not putting my name to that because it's wrong. And I'm not, but without that moral courage and that soul, the evil will prosper.
Well, people need to face it with moral courage. They need to embrace their moral compass rather than their legal compass. You really do. Look at the results of 9/11. Look at the amount of damage and the amount of death that we've caused around the planet. Irrespective of the terrorist attack that happened on the day, look at what's happening as a response. We need to have the moral courage to stand up and address this. We really do.
When you look at 9/11, and the official story of 9/11, which, you know, I mean, as fairy tales go, I can't better it, frankly. But there are many, many, many people all over the world now. Some of them are groups of airline pilots that say you could never do that with those planes and all that stuff with the story that we're given. Structural engineers, people, even the system would say were credible. They're saying the 9/11 official story is impossible.
I mean, we're talking about an initiation of collapse due to thermal expansion.
Richard Gage is the founder and CEO of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. He represents over 2,300 architects and engineers who have strictly applied the scientific method in the process of concluding that WTC-7 was brought down by controlled demolition.